Socialsuite's most recent webinar around ASX 200 Materiality Insights. We're excited to bring this session to you today, and just a bit of housekeeping before we kick things off. As people are joining, you'll notice there's a chat box on the right-hand side. Obviously, standard procedure. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to drop them into the chat and we can address them as we're going along. We'll also leave a Q&A section at the end for additional questions as well. For those that are unfamiliar with Socialsuite, we are a sustainability software and services organisation founded here in Melbourne over 8 years ago. We've had the pleasure of helping over 150 ASX listed companies. So with that experience mixed in with the additional research that we've been able to conduct, hopefully we can provide you some useful insights today. Just before we do kick things off, I just want to put a poll up on the right-hand side. I'm just keen to sort of shape the conversation, just see where organisations on this webinar are at from a materiality perspective, whether it's something you're currently already running, whether it's something you're looking to start the process and run a materiality assessment, or whether you're just purely in that education phase. It's a bit too early, but it's something that your organisation is going to need to do in the future. There's a few answers coming in. It seems to be quite an even split, but I'd also just like to introduce you to our Chief Impact Officer, who's going to guide the conversation today, Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom. So over to you, Tim.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So today we are going to look at the ASX 200 and really kind of dig into a very specific component there, materiality from a sustainability point of view. We've done some research on that, and we want to share some lessons and insights. So there's 3 components here. I'll talk briefly a little bit about the methodology. So what is the data? What is the approach we've used? What is materiality even to start with? So that will be a short component. And the core will be the real insights there. So we'll take you through the data, the approach we've used, and we'll try to share with you some insights around materiality from that kind of top end of the ASX 200 companies. And then finally, a few lessons there. What are the key takeaways? What are some things to consider based on the data and the insights that we glean here today from the ASX 200? And then, as Tom flagged, there's a Q&A component. So any questions, put them there in the chat. I'll keep half an eye on that. If there's anything that comes in that I can use and answer immediately, I will do so. Otherwise, I'll leave it till the end. So with that, first of all, look at a little bit of background and methodology around what we're doing here today. First component, I'll talk a little bit about materiality, what it is and why it's important. We'll look at the ASX 200 data sets and what have we gone off. What are we using to do the analysis there? So we'll talk a little bit about, when we go through that, about the GICS, the industry standards, about SASB, which is one of the sustainability standards. And we'll talk a little bit about how we looked at materiality from a confidence level point of view. Few caveats around the work that we've done. There's the data set. There's definitely some data imperfections there. There's areas where we had to use some subjectivity and interpretation in mapping. And what exactly I mean with that, you'll see when we get through to that. And there's definitely some ongoing analysis still happening to refine the data that we have. So I think it's a pretty accurate presentation and data that we have here. There will always be some areas where there might be some imperfections. So that is a little caveat around the work that we're looking at today. Quickly, but importantly, what is materiality? So from a high-level generic way, if we say materiality really is the importance of a particular item of information to a decision maker, if we put that in the context of sustainability, what we're talking about here today, it really refers to the importance of sustainability issues to a company's financial performance. So the risk and opportunities posed to enterprise value in the short, medium, and long term. But also on the flip side, the impact on the environment and society that a company has. So there's a financial materiality point of view, and there is what we call an impact materiality point of view. You might have heard about double materiality, and that is bringing those 2 perspectives together. So that means you're going to look at your business, at sustainability matters, and you're going to apply both lenses. You're going to look at what is the my impact as a business on the world, impact materiality. You do that across your business and your entire value chain. And on the other hand, what's the world's impact on my business? So what are the risks and opportunities I face related to some of those sustainability matters? And by working out what is really important, what is really crossing that materiality threshold, you will also know then some things that are important. The first one is what to disclose. As you've seen probably in the sustainability space, there are a lot of topics, a lot of areas, and it's really about working out what is important enough, what is material to actually disclose information on that your stakeholders use and your shareholders use, your investors use in that process of determining, making decisions. That is an important component, and sometimes people stop there. That's all they think about, but there's a lot more that you can get out of doing a materiality assessment. And I would generally, flag three main ones on a business perspective. A lot of people also use that materiality assessment once they know the material issues to focus on to really influence and guide their strategy setting, be it their sustainability strategy, but ideally also the larger corporate strategy, really thinking about that. What does that mean? It also helps you to drive your resourcing and hiring around sustainability. So where are the gaps in terms of your management of particular material sustainability issues? Do you have the systems and the people in place to manage that, but also to improve? And finally, the component as well, sometimes it really helps you inform your more traditional risk management. You might have your ERM and other risks systems and oversight in place, but you might miss out some of the more non-traditional risks, the ESG risks there. So it really is a helpful exercise to feed that into the process. So a lot more benefit from an ecosystem perspective, and really it helps you with stakeholders as well, driving that stakeholder engagement, making it meaningful. So there's a lot of benefits doing materiality. So I'm not going to unpack that much more, but it gives you a little bit of a starting point about what materiality is. We are then interested in how does the ASX 200 deal with materiality. So what we did is we took a snapshot of the ASX at the 25th of January 2024, and we said, let's take this as a data set. It accounts for, generally speaking, 80% of the Australian equity market, so it's a good representative sample. Let's look then at, from a GICS, which is the Global Industry Classification Standard, let's look at the top 11 sectors, but also look at the 24 industry groups under there. And that's what you see here on the right-hand side. You can go a lot more granular, but then I think you'll lose a little bit of that consolidated quality that you get. So we've been looking mostly at the industry groups there, also done a little bit of analysis by sector to really get some insights, like what are particular groups, industry groups looking at, and are there any particular differences around that? So this is a little bit of the background, where we got the data and what we're going to look at. So what is the approach then that we're taking? The first one, if we look at it, like I said, the sectors there, if we look at the ASX 200 at the date we took that snapshot, this is what we're looking at from a GICS sector perspective, majority being in materials. We go down to financials, etc. So we see there's a interesting representation, but it's quite what we would expect from the ASX and from that 200 level. If we then break it a bit down, a bit further to that next level, really the level of analysis that we're most interested in, gives you a little bit more detail there. We still see that materials is there at the top. It kind of directly maps over. You see some of the other sectors are a little bit more further unpacked at that industry grouping level. So that gives us the snapshot of the type of companies that we're dealing with. So let's then start applying some more insights around materiality. First off, if we look at the bottom right here, we were really interested to find out of these 200 companies there, who has actually gone out and identified their material matters, material sustainability topics. We used 3 levels of what we call confidence levels. If you look at the bottom right there, you see that pie chart there, and the largest dark blue area with 65.5% is what we call direct. That means we've gone out, we've looked at this particular company, we found that in their reporting, their disclosures, they explicitly mentioned that they've done a materiality assessment. So it's very clear there was an explicit mention, and we could explicitly also see those material topic. So that is a one-on-one, basically direct. When we look at a smaller pie there, the 70.5% inferred, that is whereas the company has it reported something on ESG and sustainability, and there might be topics mentioned, but they might not have been called material topics. They might have been called sustainability or ESG focus areas. But clearly from our interpretation of the data, so this is where it becomes sometimes a little bit of interpretation and subjectivity, we do see that some level of some process and some level of assessment has taken place to identify these particular topics that they're focusing on. So that's an inferred materiality assessment. So it might have been that they have done some type of materiality assessment, but don't explicitly mention it. So implicit materiality assessment is inferred. And then there's a group that we call missing there. That might be they have not done anything on ESG sustainability, or there might be some cursory information available, but there's no way we can infer from that anything that has to do with the materiality assessment or any process around that. So if we take that then together and look at that pie there, then we see if we add up the direct and the inferred, which we would say they all have done at some level a materiality assessment, very explicitly or sometimes less explicitly, but clearly there's some outcome of a process there. 83% of the ASX 200 had identified and reported material sustainability matters. So that's quite significant. If we look then at that breakdown by industry and go through that, we see that it's pretty even there. I think the main one where there's quite a few missing would be financial services, but there's a good reason for that. We see there's quite a few funds there that really they do the minimum reporting. They're not really in that sense like a business. So there's very kind of little reporting on ESG going on, although some of those funds we found are actually running particular sustainability or ESG focused funds, and they have methodologies in how they do their portfolio building around sustainability topics. They don't issue their own sustainability reports in which they also refer materiality assessments. So that's, I think, the reason why financial services is relatively high on the missing materiality assessments. The only industry we found is software and services there, where everything was direct and explicit materiality assessments. So moving on from here, we had a look then at the materiality assessments are generally not something as a standalone, a part of an ESG report. And from the companies that have done something on ESG, when did they do their latest ESG report? We found that 70% reported on ESG in the last year. So this is not the companies that did nothing. These are the companies that we actually, found out are doing something on ESG. If we then look at the last 2 years, we're getting to 98. And if we look at the last 4 years, we get to not almost 100% there. So there's a lot of companies that are, doing that from this snapshot, doing that year-on-year ESG reporting. Few companies might wonder why they haven't released their report yet, if it's from a year previous to that. We're still looking into that, but there's a lot of ESG and sustainability reporting going on at the moment across the ASX. A question we often get then, looking at materiality assessments, is how frequently should we be doing that? A lot of companies now are looking at doing that annual sustainability reporting, become part and parcel of reporting at large. There's still a lot of separate sustainability and ESG reports. There is a movement to a more integrated reporting where there's one annual report that includes your financials and your sustainability information. I think over time we'll see things move that way. But if you do a report every year, I think the majority of companies, especially the larger companies, are already doing that. How often should you do a materiality assessment? Now, this is definitely one of the caveats here. We're still cleaning up a lot of data here. And what we found here is that in an ESG report, you can often find that there is an explicit mention of a materiality assessment, but not when that took place. So it might say the materiality assessment, gave us these topics, but was that done this year? Was it done last year? You do get occasionally from our materiality assessment from 2020, we still, use those topics and we'll do a new in-depth review next year. Or you get our annual materiality assessment, and then you know that they do one every year. So right now, we're still fine-tuning this data, but at least we see that the majority of companies here are doing that annual materiality assessment. There's some companies that do it every 2 years, or biannually they're looking at. You're doing one, keeping it for another year, and then doing it again. And some other companies that we look at 3 or 4 years ago. So we found that some somewhat smaller companies there, they've done that assessment, and there might have been a big exercise for them. So they're kind of riding on that for a few years. You do get some companies stating that they do some review over it. And then the question is, like, how deep have they gone on that? The question we often get then, what is best practice? What should we be doing? Now, if you look at what companies are doing at a global best practice level, and what European legislation, which is often seen as the front runner in a lot of ESG and sustainability requirements, they've now mandated annual double materiality assessment is the starting point of your sustainability reporting process. Now, we do find that they don't tell you how to do that double materiality assessment. So that could be where we see some companies do a very in-depth and long materiality assessment 1 year, and alternate that then with the next year with more of a light touch review. So we did the big exercise last year. We'll do a review of that this year, and then we'll just start that process again. So there's a variety of ways. There's not one set or one right way to do that, but we do see that having at least that annual review of your material topics is really best practice. And then how deep you go and how exactly you do that, that is really up to you as a company. Another key question then that we often get when we work with companies on materiality, doing that assessment, where do I sit in terms of how many material topics should I aim for? Or when does something become material, and how many topics is normal or not? So what we found is there's a very broad range here. So what we do see is that we're looking here at the number of material topics identified by companies, and then how many companies have that particular number of topics. So there was one company, if we look at it on the left here, that identified 3 material topics. And then there were 6 companies that had 4 material topics identified. So that's kind of how it works, all the way down to there was one company that had 41 material topics. Now, the question here generally is like, what's good? What should you be doing? So what we try to do, and there's no right answer there. It's quite hard. And that's why I want to unpack this a little bit detailed today here. So what we do see here, that the average of topics here is around just under 11 topics, so say 11 topics there. We thought maybe it is interesting to look at that direct versus inferred. Does that make any difference really between, it's the tail end where you get to a lot of topics more inferred, because it's less clear there. But we do see there's a lot of direct materiality assessments happening there, and across the board. It's a pretty mixed bag, so it doesn't really tell us a lot. We see then that most of the topics would sit in that broader range of, say, between 4 and 20 topics, with really the average there sitting 10, 11, 12 topics there. That is where most companies land somehow. What is going on with the long tail there? Why are there, after 20 topics, it drops quite significantly, but there's still companies that have quite a few topics there. I think from here, it's worth looking at a bit of a qualitative case study to look at that in a little bit more detail. I had a discussion with Anthony McMullen from Woodside, and very interesting. He shared a lot of insight on the process and how we think about a process. And what we found in our initial data set is that our team capturing, for all these companies' topics, we captured 11 topics for Woodside. But already I noticed that they had on their website for 2023, when reviewing the data, 4 material topics. So something was going on there. So I put up that report again. And then I noticed that, yes, they had 4 material topics. If you look at the left here on the column 1, there's 4 topics there that are material. But there's another 3 topics that are significant, and there's another 4 topics that are important. So altogether, there are 11 ESG topics that are relevant to Woodside, that have identified as let's use relevant as a pretty generic term, that are on the radar. We know we need to monitor and manage these topics, but to what degree? And I think that goes back to that previous slide where we looked at that long tail there. Some companies are struggling with this, and there's a lot of different practices around this. Some people identify all these topics and would say everything identified is material. So in that case, we would have 11 topics here. But you can also, it depends where you set your thresholds for materiality. So what I did as an example, and this is not from Woodside, it's on the right-hand side, that little materiality matrix there, just to illustrate the point here, is that if we look at those topics there, just to plot them, then what we see is those at the bottom left there, there's 4 topics that are, important. They're sitting as, the least important or least relevant, so to say, out of all the topics, but they should be on the radar, and we should be managing and monitoring those topics and doing something about it. Then we move a bit more to the middle there, topics become significant, and at some point we've put a threshold in where if a relevant topic crosses the threshold, it becomes a material topic. And really that means we now need to disclose on that topic. So we don't just have to manage that topic, but we need to disclose on that topic as well. That could explain, if we look to this slide again here, where some of those companies with that long kind of tail there might have identified 30 relevant topics. They haven't really specified in that, where the materiality thresholds sit, or they just assumed everything in there is material. And that is an ongoing challenge that we see a lot of companies have, is to think about setting materiality thresholds. So that's something that the Europeans are also really looking at and really thinking about and helping to guide you. But in the end, it's up to you as a business to decide where you set your materiality thresholds. This is 2 illustrations here that are based on the guidance issued by EFRAG in the European Union, where you see the matrix is slightly different. It's a double materiality matrix with on the y-axis impact materiality, so that's the impacts you are having on the world, and on the x-axis financial materiality, that is the risks and opportunities that these sustainability topics are putting on your business. The moment you cross that red line, if we look at the right-hand side here, we see that if you cross it on that x-axis, then something becomes financially material. You have to disclose. On the y-axis, impact material. And if it sits in that top right there, it's double material. All those blue boxes, all 3 of them are material. But where do you set that materiality threshold? If we look at the left illustration there, it's pretty low. Something is quite quickly seen as material. And because it is up to a company, that might explain where some companies have different materiality appetites, and some companies have a lot more topics that are classified as material versus other companies that put out those thresholds more. Both of those white boxes there are not material, monitor, not required to disclose. So it means often monitor and manage. So don't drop it off. It doesn't mean it's not relevant. Often when you see it, when a topic makes it on your radar, so to say, in your matrix, you will have to monitor it, you have to manage it to a degree, but you might not have to disclose on it. So it's really important in your materiality assessment to think about these thresholds, but also to really document and think about your rationale and methodology of how you've gone about setting thresholds. The next component then is we wanted to look at what are the topics that companies report on as material. So the very first one is that we captured all the topics these companies reported in their report. So we captured on the ASX 200, we captured over 2,000 topics, so 2,238 topics altogether. That is the companies, of course, that identified material topics. Now, looking at that, if you look at the left, I've just kind of few example snapshots of some topics. There are some problems, of course, with that because everyone uses different language. So if we look at the left there, when we talk at large about the topic of anti-corruption, you see there's a lot of different ways people have, kind of focused on anti-corruption. There's a lot of differences in writing it, the ampersand or the and, or putting 1 or 2 anti-bribery and anti-corruption together. So it's really that lack of standardized reporting that makes it a little bit of a subjective assessment at times and makes the mapping harder. If we look at the middle column there, which is really more about occupational health and safety, but you do see in there that sometimes it's mentioned, human rights is added in there, modern slavery. Safety is in there, occupational health and safety, but well-being is in there. There's one mention of environment. So when we see that, we sometimes have to map multiple topics to a particular topic in there to get it as appropriate as possible mapping of the topics. And again, then the final one is human rights, but we see other things come up in there, supply chain, labor practices. So sometimes these things are all grouped together. So at large, in our analysis, we found that you could say there were 4 categories of topics that we found. The standardized topics. So these are topics that have been set by ESG and sustainability standards like SASB, GRI, the European ESRS, or rating agencies like MSCI. So they have their set of topics. It's a certain way you write that, a certain wording, and we find that they're exactly captured in there. So that means that a company has gone out, done the materiality assessment, and in that assessment, use those topics or mapped it back to those particular topics. Now, that is, of course, for us ideal because that makes it really easy to map. Sometimes then, as a next level under that, they customize the wording or they customize, bring 2 topics together. That's the third one. We see that joint topics there. And then there's unique topics, so anything else. We've seen a whole range of pretty unique terminology and topics in there. And there's a different level of granularity being used as well, all the way from the pillars, the EDS and the G, environment or social or governance, to general issue categories like SASB has, to a topic level or subtopic, or even as ESRS has a subtopic. So there's different ranges of granularity of where topics live. For our purposes then, we've looked at SASB and looked at their general issue category. So that's 26 topics. Under that, there are disclosure topics, and there's almost 200 disclosure topics, and they are specific to the particular industry the company sits in. So there's some doubling up in there, so that didn't make it very kind of useful to map against that. So that was our choice then to say, we're going to go for this 26 topics. That is a good consolidated view of how we can map over all those unique topics that we find that the ASX companies are using into more of a consolidated set of topics there. We're still on mapping against those disclosure topics from SASB, and we're trying to map again other standards as well, like I said, GRI and ESRS, and we're looking at more of a consolidated mapping as well. So we will be producing later a white paper on this with all the information. So if you're interested in that, definitely keep an eye out on that. So if we then look at the total unique topics that we find across all the companies, then we see that on the left here, although the mapped topics here, so this is back to that mapping from SASB, 26 what they call general issue categories. So say there are categories of ESG topics. The top one here across all the industries is human rights and community relations. Now, if we think about the ASX and what we looked at before, there's a big representation of material companies. Now, they often care about things like human rights and local content and stakeholder engagement and community relations, Indigenous and First Nations. All those things are captured in that particular topic. So it's not surprising to see that at the top of the list there. As a second then, employee engagement, diversity, inclusion. That is something that we've really seen across pretty much every industry. Really important these days. I'm not going to go through every topic here, but I'll do a few at the top there. Business ethics is your governance, corporate governance at large. It captured a lot of subtopics there, from anti-corruption that I mentioned to tax transparency, remuneration, quality of the governance body, diversity at the board level. There's a whole range of things in business ethics. So any focus on corporate governance is often captured by business ethics. So that is important to pretty much every industry. So hence is a third place, not surprising. From a environment point of view, there's a few categories there, and a lot of it is captured by ecological impacts. So things like biodiversity, nature, all those things sit in there. There's a few separate topics more focused on climate. So when we look at the physical impacts of climate change and GHG emissions, they have their own separate topics. There's one air quality, but that's very specific. So that's quite interesting. That sits at the bottom because it's only relevant to a pretty limited group of companies. So anything like on that environment kind of level is captured by ecological impacts. Then going through that down, you get a good overview of what topics are important. But does that then change if you look at the different industry groups? Now, we've looked at a lot of them, but just a few insights here from first looking at that largest group, materials. Like I said earlier, is that human rights and community relations sitting at the top there is not surprising. Kind of expected that. I am a bit more surprised that in that materials and resource sector, so to say, that GHG emissions and physical impacts of climate change are not slightly higher on the list. They're definitely not all the way at the bottom, but I would have expected with the incoming ASRS legislation that forces Australian companies to start reporting on climate. Of course, this is looking back. So I would expect going forward that in particular GHG emissions will move up in terms of material topics, particularly for that materials industry group. If we look at financial services, which was the second sector and group, then we see in there that, yes, compared to materials, we see that data security moves up a fair bit there. We see that business ethics or corporate governance is really high there, so tops the list. And then finally, for banks, we see two other topics really move to the top there: selling practices and product labeling. And we also see access and affordability. So both two kind of not surprising there. So a few insights there that are quite interesting. So you can look at each sector. There's some slight movement in terms of the topics in each industry group as well. You see topics move around, and that is what you would expect. Every industry has their own particular issues that are most relevant, and every business again then has their own particular material topics. So with that, that is the key insights. Like I said, there's a lot more that will follow in our white paper down the track. So what are the main lessons then if we think about these things? What have we learned from this and looking at this? I think the first one is that materiality really matters. So we've seen a majority of companies are actually doing this exercise there. If they're ESG reporting, they see the value of doing that materiality assessment to really identify the topics they have to disclose on from a materiality point of view, help them direct their strategy, not just sustainability, but also corporate strategy. And from more qualitative insight, we do see that as well, that is being mentioned in ESG reports, that its materiality is not just to identify the topics, but to really drive more that long-term planning, set ambitious targets and goals, and really help drive that strategic thinking at the board and management level. It is also being used to, like I flagged, to set that, thinking and budget around what do we need to do to make sure that we have the right resourcing systems in place and improve on what we're doing. Second point then, when you go through this exercise really early already, start to think about what is our determination of material. Yes, it's relatively easy to work out your long list of relevant topics, but when does a relevant topic then become material? Or if we look at the case of Woodside, they had a really kind of neat way of saying, yes, all these things are relevant, but some are important and some are significant and some are really crossing the threshold and becoming material then. And then who in your business is on your materiality determination team, or whoever is, decision maker to say, this is where we put those thresholds. Think about that. That's really important. How many topics then are material versus relevant? Like I said, consider that and think about what is your methodology? What is your rationale? Document it. There's not a particular right way. There's not one way that everyone does it. There's a lot of different ways. But think about it and capture it. Be transparent. Another thing is trying to, in that exercise, in doing an exercise, what you're doing is avoiding a captain's call. So what we mean with that is we sometimes see that the materiality assessment is really just an indiscriminate or uninformed pick by someone in a business of these are the topics we're going to report on. There's not really been an assessment taking place. It's just a captain's call on these are the 10 topics we'll report upon. By doing that materiality assessment, you avoid the indiscriminate picking of topics, and you actually have a process. You actually have a methodology and rationale how you got to that set of topics. In doing that, consider to standardize your topics as well with a standard, which really makes it easier to, enable comparison, but it also makes reporting easier. Because if you have a standardized set of topics and standards, that often links to disclosure, so you know what to disclose as well. What's the right or the wrong one? Look at what you're required to do from a legislative point of view, if anything, and then look at what's relevant to you. Something like SASB, more investor focus, something like GRI, more broader stakeholder focus from an impact perspective, sometimes a combination. Are you affected by European legislation? And look at CSRD and ESRS as well. And in that process, it might sound like a lot of work, and it could be, but it can also be really a useful and interesting exercise in which you don't want to aim for perfection. Every company and every consultant, I can tell you that, has a different materiality assessment process. So if you talk to a company or talk to a consultant or look at a platform, they each have their own process and their own way of getting you to that end there. There's definitely a movement to kind of, create a more uniform process there, and we might be there, getting there over the next few years. So with that, I want to invite Tom back to the stage here and see if there's any particular questions that we can answer around the ASX 200, the materiality insights that we shared with you today.
Thanks, Tim. Some really useful insights and what can be quite a complex process with the materiality assessment. So obviously Socialsuite does have a software solution coupled with services, whether you're an organization currently bringing this process in-house and just looking to streamline that process, or if you're an organization that's looking at starting that journey, we can offer a bit more of a facilitated option there as well. What I might do is just drop my sort of calendar link in the chat on the right hand side. Obviously, feel free to jump on our website and look at the information or book a call on there, but feel free to book it directly into my calendar if that's of any interest. Just skipping on to any questions. I know that Maxine has popped a question in there. So as we're just going through that one question, if anyone else has got anything they'd like to ask, then feel free to pop that into the chat now. But Maxine has asked, is the focus on human rights and community relations, and what are you seeing in markets outside of Australia?
A good question. It's a very interesting question. What we see happening is, and I think it's taking a step back from the particular topic, but I'll address that as well, is looking at your entire value chain. So traditionally, I think a lot of companies is really focused on their core business. And say you're in the US, for instance, and that's where your core business is creating some products, then a lot of people say, well, there's no human rights issues there. It's it might be relevant, not material. We're not going to disclose. But if you look at a larger value chain, and you're looking at, well, where are you getting your raw products from that you use to produce whatever product you're producing, your raw materials, you might be sourcing that from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's where a lot of key resources come from. There's a lot of issues there with forced labor, child labor, environmental degradation. So then suddenly, if you look at the value chain and take where your upstream and downstream come into play as well from a business activities point of view, suddenly then it does become a material topic, or potentially could become a material topic. So it really depends a little bit on the geography your operations are in and how you look at that. So there's still a lot of companies that focus on core business only and leave the supply chain, the rest of the value chain out of that assessment there. So it depends. So human rights and community relations, yes, it comes up often around modern slavery or engagement with communities, First Nations. It depends where you are and how companies look at that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Question from Grace. What responsibility do you believe ASX-listed companies have to ensure stakeholders such as retail investors understand the published sustainability reporting material?
It's a great question. I think there's definitely a level of responsibility in terms of trying to make it accessible information and make it understandable. So, and I think that goes back to a point that's really becoming more important as well, is in particular around materiality. more traditionally, what we saw what companies did with materiality is they just publish, we've done a materiality assessment, and here are 10 topics, for instance. That's what's material. That was sufficient back in the day, but right now there's a real strong focus. I think both from GRI and the European legislation that's saying that's only 50% of what's required from a disclosure perspective, your topics. The other 50% is how did you get there? So that's your methodology, your approach, the process, the stakeholder engagement. Document everything and share that in a transparent way so that people understand that journey. And with that, if you look at retail investors as well, what role do they play in that? And can they see that? So that's a specific example around materiality, but it is really interesting to look at from a perspective of make sure that people understand how you got there and make sure that they can actually interpret the information that you're sharing with them. So is your 60-page ESG report, is that understandable? Is that too long? Do you also issue a summary in 3 pages with the key things that people can understand that are less ESG literate for that matter?
Yeah, and that's an important point you said about the transparency, Tim. I don't think there's any expectation for companies to be perfect. There's a lot of change and it's quickly evolving, but certainly just providing that transparency will help provide credibility with various stakeholders. So. Question from Siobhan, what are your thoughts on AASB?
There's a lot to say about the AASB. So what we're going to see is the introduction of the Australian reporting standards that are based on the ISSB standards, but it's a specific Australian version. So you might be familiar with the ISSB. They've issued IFRS S1 and S2, and S1 is general sustainability disclosures, and S2 is climate-focused disclosures. Now, the ASSB has now created the ASRS 1 and 2, and what they've done with the standards, IFRS S1 and S2, is really made them climate focused. So they've kind of now removed the broader overall general sustainability focus and said, we're just going to focus on climate now. So you could argue in a way, it's been focused more on one thing. What's happening with that right now, they're in consultation, so they've closed the consultation rounds. There were 2, one run by ASB, one by Treasury. They each have their own consultation on that. They're processing that now. There are rumors that there's going to be some delay, 6 to 12 months. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to confirm. They've done their own webinar recently to try to answer questions. But the problem is a lot of questions that people like here today in our webinar and other people will have, they can't answer them yet. So with the ASSB, I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of things people want to know, but even the ASB can't answer those questions yet. Besides that, there's some really good summaries out there. We're going to do a session on the ASB and the ASRS standards, a webinar upcoming, maybe next month already, see if we can answer some questions, but we're just waiting for a little bit more information on that as well, not to repeat what already is out there and not being able to answer questions. So I think we'll learn more soon on that. And as soon as there's more information available to the market, we'll share that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And onto a framework that's been out there a little bit longer. What are your thoughts on GRI?
The Global Reporting Initiative. Yeah, it's been one of the oldest frameworks, but still going strong, very strong even. You could argue at the moment, when you look at all the ESG standards and frameworks, there were a lot out there 3-4 years ago. People called it the alphabet soup and all the acronyms. There's definitely been some consolidation. GRI's come out well. They're still, they've always been standing strong and it's still standing strong. A lot has been consolidated into the ISSB. So SASB is now part of that. TCFD is part of that, the Integrated Reporting Framework. So you could look at from a voluntary reporting standard, you really have the 2 big ones, ISSB or SASB, so to say, with TCFD in there, and then GRI. Now, the key differences would be that the ISSB is really made for investors. They take that financial materiality point of view. So that is really, how is the world impacting your business? That's what you're focused on. Whereas GRI, it's almost like the flip side. They're saying, how are you as a business impacting the world? So there are 2 different perspectives. What is better? Well, that is always the question. Should you be doing both and looking at both perspectives? From a double materiality perspective, most definitely. But should you be reporting on? Talk to your stakeholders. What are your investors requesting from you in terms of, the disclosures you're providing? Is it mostly your investors asking for things? Do you have a broader set of stakeholders? Are you, asked for, your impacts on the world? Consider GRI.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just conscious on time. We've run out of time. I know there's a few additional questions, but we'll reach out to you separately and respond to those questions. Jamie, in answer to your question, we will be sending out the recording shortly after today's session. We'll also attach the presentation on there as well. So, yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for their time, and hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day. Thanks very much.